It began with a single misplaced femur in a dusty basement in rural Ohio. Not a fossilized remain of some prehistoric megafauna, not the weathered bone of a misplaced pioneer. Something else. It was found in a crate labelled as irrigation equipment, tucked behind a stack of census records from 1894 that had never been digitised. When I held the photograph of it, the scale didn't make sense. The proportions were human. The density was mammalian, but the measurements defied every biological law we have been taught to accept as gospel. If you place a standard human femur next to this specimen, the discrepancy is not merely a matter of height. It is a matter of load distribution. The bone was built to carry a weight that our modern frames would collapse under. I asked the curator why it wasn't on display. He didn't say it was fake. He didn't say it was a hoax. He simply said it didn't exist. He looked through me as if the crate were empty, as if the very air between us had been scrubbed of its history. This is how the erasure starts, not with a bonfire of books, but with a quiet, institutional turning of the head. Ask yourself why a discovery that would rewrite the origin of our species is treated with the same bureaucratic indifference as a lost library card. What if the history we are sold is not a record of what happened, but a curated gallery of what we are permitted to know? I tracked the origins of that crate back to a series of mound excavations in the late 19th century, a time when the American frontier was being ploughed under to make room for progress. What the surveyors found beneath the earth didn't fit the narrative of a primitive, wandering people. They found sophisticated masonry. They found mathematical alignments with the stars. And they found the skeletons, thousands of them, not 6 feet tall, not 7, 9, 10, sometimes 12 feet in height, often buried with copper armour and scrolls that no one could read. The newspapers of the 1880s were full of these accounts. They weren't tucked away in the paranormal tabloids of the day. They were on the front pages of the New York Times and the Smithsonian's own internal reports. Then suddenly, the reports stopped. The bones were crated. The mounds were levelled. The giants were smoothed out of the timeline. It was a systematic thinning of the herd of facts. We are told that evolution is a slow, steady climb from the mud to the heavens, a linear progression of increasing complexity and height. But the earth tells a different story. It tells a story of cycles. It tells a story of a great before that we are not supposed to remember. If you look at the architecture of the old world, the anomalies are everywhere, hiding in plain sight. Walk through the cathedrals of Europe or the megalithic ruins of the Andes and look at the doors, not the small, human-sized entrances cut into the bottom, but the original archways. Look at the height of the steps. We are told these were built for God, a grand gesture of religious devotion meant to make the worshipper feel small. But what if they weren't built for a metaphor? What if they were built for the inhabitants? We see the massive lintels of Baalbek, stones weighing over 800 tons, and we are told they were moved by thousands of slaves with ropes and wooden rollers. We are told this by men in suits who have never lifted anything heavier than a pen. Ask yourself if a wooden roller can support 800 tons without turning to dust. Ask yourself why every ancient culture, separated by vast oceans and thousands of years, tells the exact same story of a race of giants who preceded them. The Greeks called them Titans. The Hebrews called them Nephilim. The Norse called them Jotun. Are we to believe that the entire human race suffered from the same collective hallucination? Or is it more likely that the hallucination is the one we are living in now? The modern academic complex operates on a principle of exclusion. Anything that doesn't fit the established model of human development is labelled an outlier. But when the outliers number in the thousands, they are no longer exceptions. They are the data set. I began to map these excavations, plotting the coordinates of every giant skeleton reported in the 19th century. A pattern emerged. They weren't scattered randomly. They were clustered around high-energy ley lines and ancient copper mines. They were the architects of a global infrastructure that functioned on principles we have long since forgotten. They understood the resonance of stone. They understood the geometry of the earth. And then they were gone. Not through natural extinction, not through a slow decline. They were removed. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a managed disappearance. It is the silence of a Smithsonian warehouse. It is the silence of a history book that skips 1,000 years of development because the evidence is too large to fit on the page. We are living in the ruins of a much larger world, walking through halls designed for beings twice our size, and we have been conditioned to see it as normal. Consider the nature of the cover-up. It is not a conspiracy of a few men in a dark room. It is a conspiracy of a system that cannot handle a challenge to its foundational myths. If giants existed, then the Darwinian timeline is a lie. If giants existed, then the primitive nature of our ancestors is a lie. If giants existed, then the technology used to build the pyramids was not a matter of muscle and sweat, but of a physical capability we can no longer comprehend. I spoke to a retired surveyor who worked for the Department of the Interior in the 1970s. He told me about a site in the Grand Canyon that was cordoned off by the military after a group of hikers found a series of caverns filled with giant mummies. He didn't talk about aliens or magic. He talked about the paperwork. He talked about the non-disclosure agreements. He talked about the way the artifacts were loaded onto unmarked trucks and driven into the desert. This is the staccato rhythm of the erasure. Find, report, seize, silence. Not this truth, not that truth, the official truth. We see it in the way the media handles fringe history. They wrap it in ridicule. They frame it with experts who explain away the inexplicable with phrases like geological anomaly or symbolic representation. But you cannot explain away a double row of teeth. You cannot explain away 6-fingered hands carved into the rock art of 5 continents. You cannot explain away the sheer physical reality of a 9-foot skull. The evidence is leaning against the door, and the gatekeepers are straining to keep it shut. They tell us that we are the pinnacle of human achievement, the smartest and most advanced version of our species. But what if we are the leftovers? What if we are the smaller, more manageable versions of a prototype that was deemed too dangerous or too independent to remain? The giants didn't just disappear, they were replaced. We are the inheritors of their world, but we have been given a sterilized version of the deed. Every time you see a forbidden archaeological site, every time you see a restricted zone in a national park, you are looking at a crime scene where history was murdered at. The further I pushed into the archives, the more I realized that the erasure was global. In the islands of the South Pacific, the elders speak of the lords of the sea, men who could carry basalt pillars like they were palm fronds. In the deserts of the Middle East, there are ruins so vast they are known as the works of the old men. In every instance, the local memory is vivid, specific, and grounded in physical reality. And in every instance, the Western academic tradition has dismissed these memories as myth. This is the institutional gatekeeping of the soul, and by labelling the giants as myth, they relegate our true history to the realm of children's stories. They make it safe, they make it small. But if you look at the load distribution of the walls at Sasai Huaman, you see a logic. that is anything but small. You see stones fitted together with a precision that defies a razor blade, locked in place by a gravity that we can barely calculate today. Ask yourself why a primitive people would go to the trouble of moving stones the size of houses when smaller stones would have sufficed. What if for them those stones weren't heavy? What if for them the scale was appropriate? The tension in the air when you ask these questions at a university is palpable. It is the tension of a structure that knows its foundations are rotting. There is an unsettling feeling that comes from realizing that your teachers were taught to lie to you. It isn't a malicious lie, perhaps, but a comfortable one. It is easier to teach a history that makes sense than a history that includes giants. It is easier to believe that we are the masters of the earth than to admit we are the tenants of a ghost house. The somatic response to this realization is a kind of vertigo. You look at the horizon and you realize it's been painted on. You look at the mountains and you wonder what's buried inside them. The giants are not just a historical mystery, they are a psychological threat. They represent a scale of existence that dwarfs our own ambitions. I found a ledger in an estate sale in Virginia, belonging to a man who had been a field agent for the Bureau of Ethnology in the late 1800s. The entries were chilling in their clinical detachment. October 14th, uncovered 3 skeletons in Mound 72. Average height 8 feet 6 inches. Crushed skulls indicated blunt force trauma. Relocated to the main facility for processing. October 18th. Received orders to backfill the site and remove all references to skeletal dimensions from the public log. Documentation forwarded to the secretary. This is the paper trail of a vanishing act. The blunt force trauma mentioned wasn't from a battle, it was from the archaeologists. They weren't just digging up history, they were killing it again. They were making sure the evidence was processed until it no longer existed. What if the giants didn't die out thousands of years ago? What if they were still here when we arrived, and we were the weapons used to clear them away? We are told that the indigenous peoples of the Americas were the first inhabitants, but their own legends say otherwise. They say they fought a war against the red-haired giants who lived in the caves. They say they had to burn them out to survive. This is the revisionist nightmare. We aren't the brave explorers discovering a new world. We are the cleanup crew. The somber reality of this possibility changes everything. It turns our history into a crime report. It turns our museums into evidence lockers. We walk through the halls of the great institutions and we see the pottery, the beads, the tiny fragments of a primitive life, and we are told this is the whole story. But in the basements, in the crates that are never opened, the real story is waiting. It is a story of a different kind of human, a being that saw the world from a different height, that heard the earth in a different frequency. The institutional erasure is so complete that we don't even have a word for the grief of losing a history we never knew we had. There is a specific staccato rhythm to the way truth is suppressed. A discovery is made. A local news station runs a segment. A university team arrives. The area is cordoned off. The findings are misplaced during transport. A follow-up study concludes the original find was a misidentification of mastodon remains, not a giant, not a human, something else, something safe, something that doesn't require us to change our textbooks. This pattern has been repeated in South Africa, in Siberia, in the Australian outback. It is a global immune response. The status quo is an organism that protects itself from the infection of the truth, but the truth is persistent. It leaks through the cracks. It manifests in the out-of-place artifacts that continue to be found by amateur explorers. I met a man in Nevada who showed me a footprint in a slab of sandstone. It was unmistakable. 5 toes, a clear arch, and a heel, but it was 16 inches long, and it was in a layer of rock that was supposedly millions of years old. The academic answer is erosion. The academic answer is coincidence. Ask yourself how many coincidences it takes to make a pattern. Ask yourself how much erosion it takes to carve a perfect anatomical human foot into solid stone. The intellectual provocation here is not just that giants existed, but that they existed when we were told nothing existed. It shatters the glass floor of our reality. It suggests that the Earth has been home to civilizations that make our current technology look like toys. The load distribution of these civilizations was not built on fossil fuels and plastic. It was built on something more fundamental. And that is why they had to be erased, because if we understood how they lived, we might realize how poorly we are living now. The sense of forbidden knowledge is addictive. Once you see the first giant, you see them everywhere. You see them in the oversized handles on ancient temple doors. You see them in the height of the stone benches in the ruins of Tiwanaku. You see them in the myths of the sky people who descended to earth and shared their wisdom. The erasure trope is not just about the bones. It is about the wisdom. The giants were said to be the keepers of the stars, the masters of the heavenly mathematics. When they were removed, that knowledge was broken into pieces and hidden away in secret societies and hermetic traditions. We are left with the scraps, the mysteriously advanced knowledge of the Sumerians and the Egyptians that seemingly appeared out of nowhere. It didn't appear out of nowhere. It was handed down from them to us. But we are the ungrateful heirs who have forgotten the faces of our benefactors. I went to the British Museum and spent hours looking at the Assyrian reliefs. The kings are always depicted as being twice the size of their subjects. We are told this is artistic license, a way to show their importance. But what if it was literal? What if the king was a king because he was a giant? What if the divine right of kings was originally a biological reality? The skepticism of authority begins when you realize that authority is a mask. It is a way for small men to pretend they have the stature of the ones who came before. The staccato beat of the investigation leads us to a terrifying conclusion. We are not the protagonists of this story. We are the sequel that no one asked for. The mystery of the red-haired giants is perhaps the most unsettling of all. From the Lovelock Cave in Nevada to the Paracas skulls in Peru, the evidence points to a specific ethnic group of giants with elongated heads and auburn hair. DNA testing on the Paracas remains showed mitochondrial mutations that are not found in any known human, primate, or animal. The results were published, and then they were ignored. The lab was pressured. The researchers were discredited. Not human. Not alien. Something else. The institutional erasure here is aggressive. It's as if this specific lineage is the one they are most afraid of. Why? What is it about these red-haired architects that threatens the foundation of our world? Perhaps it's because they didn't just build monuments, they built a legacy that is still active in our collective unconscious. We fear the big bad wolf, the giant at the top of the beanstalk. We have been conditioned to see them as monsters, as something to be slain by the normal hero. This is the ultimate propaganda. We have been taught to cheer for the destruction of our own ancestors. We have been taught to be afraid of the very beings who could have shown us a different way to live. The somber reality is that the war against the giants never really ended. It just moved into the shadows. It moved into the textbooks. It moved into the way we perceive ourselves. We are the civilized ones because we are small. We are the evolved ones because we are manageable. What if the giants are not dead? What if they are just elsewhere? The historical mystery doesn't end with a burial. It ends with a departure. There are stories in the Himalayas and the Andes of sleeping giants in stasis chambers, waiting for a time when the world is ready for their return. It sounds like science fiction until you look at the energy signatures around certain holy mountains. It sounds like a conspiracy theory until you look at the military presence around the North and South Poles. The giants are the unresolved philosophical open loop of our existence. They represent a potential that we have been denied. They are the mirror that shows us how much we have shrunk. As I stand on the edge of a levelled mound in the Ohio Valley, looking at the suburban houses built over the graves of kings, I feel a profound sense of loss. We have traded our stature for comfort. We have traded our history for a narrative. The investigation doesn't end here. It can't, because as long as there is one misplaced bone, one oversized doorway, one myth that rings true, the giants are still with us. They are waiting for us to stop looking at the floor and start looking at the ceiling, and they are waiting for us to ask the one question the institutions cannot answer. Why are you so afraid of them? The final pattern is one of a resonance. The giants were built for a world with a different frequency, a world where the air was thicker, the gravity perhaps a fraction lighter, and the connection between mind and matter was a physical bridge. When the world changed, they couldn't. Or perhaps they wouldn't. They became the ghosts in the machine of our development. We find their tools and we call them ceremonial objects because we can't figure out how to grip them. We find their calendars and we call them primitive star charts because we can't see the fourth dimension they were tracking. The erasure is not just of their bodies, but of their perception. We are living in a low-resolution version of reality, a staccato existence of birth, work, and death, while the giants lived in a symphony. The tension of this realization is the tension of an investigator who has found the truth but has no one to tell it to. If I show you the photograph, you will see a bone. If I show you the data, you will see an anomaly. But if I show you the world as it was, you will see yourself as you are, a shadow of a former glory. The giants are gone, but the scale remains. The load distribution of history is still leaning on us, whether we acknowledge it or not. Ask yourself, what if the next giant to be erased is you? What if the system that scrubbed them from the books is already starting to scrub us? Not this future, not that future, something else, something silent, something final. The silence following the suppression of the Parakastata was not an end but a pivot. It moved from the physical to the structural. If you look at the architectural load distribution of the great megaliths, you realize the builders were not just accounting for weight, but for a specific kind of atmospheric pressure that no longer exists, not a change in weather, not a change in climate. Something else. The bones tell us they were taller, but the engineering tells us they were heavier, in a way that our current gravity would find intolerable. Ask yourself why the foundations of the oldest structures on Earth are sunk 50 feet into the bedrock, far beyond the needs of the stone they support. What if the Earth itself has changed? What if the giants didn't just disappear because of a war or a famine, but because the very medium of life became too thin to sustain them? This is the somatic reality of the investigation. You begin to feel the air around you as a cage. You look at the massive, empty throne rooms of the Hittites, and you don't see a display of power. You see a space designed for a lung capacity we can no longer achieve. The institutional gatekeeping of this information is vital because it protects the most sacred lie of modern science that the Earth is a closed, static system. If the giants were adapted to a different physical reality, then the history of our planet is not a slow crawl of progress, but a series of catastrophic shifts. Each shift leaves behind a race of survivors who are smaller, weaker, and more easily controlled. We are the result of the latest thinning. We are the specimens that can survive on the scraps of a dying atmosphere. The investigative essayist must ask, who benefits from our smallness? Who gains from a population that is physically incapable of reaching the heights of its predecessors? I tracked a shipment of unclassified biological anomalies from a port in Peru to a private facility in the outskirts of Brussels. It wasn't a museum. It wasn't a university. It was a holding company with ties to 3 different global central banks. This is where the patterns overlap. The erasure of the giants is not just a project for historians. It is a necessity for the financiers of our reality. If we knew that a previous civilization existed without the need for our current energy grids, the entire economic structure would collapse. The giants didn't just have bigger bodies, they had a bigger understanding of the world's resonance. They built their cities on the nodes of the Earth's natural grid. They didn't need to burn the planet to power their lives. Not this energy, not that energy, something else. The tension of the forbidden knowledge lies in this realization. The giants were erased because they were free. They were the ultimate outliers in a system that demands conformity. I stood outside that facility in Brussels and felt the hum of the cooling units. Inside, the evidence of a free world was being kept at a constant 50 degrees away from the eyes of a public that is currently paying for its own enslavement. The staccato beat of the security patrol was a reminder that the truth is guarded more closely than gold. Ask yourself why a bone would be more dangerous than $1 billion. What if that bone is the key to a door they spent 10,000 years trying to lock? The transition from the 19th century discovery phase to the 20th century concealment phase was marked by a specific event, the 1913 reorganization of the major museums. This was the moment the anomaly drawers were installed. It was the moment the staff was purged of anyone who asked too many questions about the skeletons from the mounds. The language of the memos changed from extraordinary human remains to a problematic ethnographic material. This is the pseudo-academic camouflage. If you call a giant a problem, you don't have to explain why it's 10 feet tall. You just have to solve the problem by making it disappear. I spoke with a former archivist who had been tasked with cataloguing the off-manifest items in a prominent London museum. She told me about a skull with a cranial capacity 40% larger than a modern human's. It didn't look deformed. It didn't look like a product of head binding. It was a masterpiece of biological symmetry. She was told to label it as a hydrocephalic infant and move it to a sub-basement that was later sealed due to asbestos. This is the erasure trope in its most clinical form. Use a health hazard to hide a historical truth. Use a label to blind the eye. What if the asbestos and mould that keep us out of the deep archives are just modern versions of the dragons on the old maps? They are the warnings designed to keep the curious from finding the hoard in the mountains of Georgia. There are giants' graves that the local villagers still fear to touch. They say the bones inside are not cold, that they still possess a residual charge. When I visited, I brought a simple EMF meter. The readings near the undisturbed mounds were off the charts, not a mineral deposit, not a power line, something else. The ground itself was pulsing. This is the pattern-based investigation leading us toward the resonance of stone. The giants weren't just big, they were conductive. Their bones, often reported to have a high metallic content, acted as antennas for the Earth's natural frequency. This is why they were buried in specific geometric alignments. Their cemeteries were power plants. Their ancestors were the grid. When we dig them up and put them in wooden boxes in a dry museum, we are breaking a circuit. We are grounding the history of the world. The somber realization here is that our current civilization is a bypass. We have built a noisy, flickering world over a silent, powerful one. The skepticism of authority must extend to the very ground we walk on. We are told the earth is a dead rock we must exploit, but the giants knew it was a living battery. They were the terminals. Ask yourself, what happens when the battery is fully drained? What happens when the last terminal is removed and placed in a crate in Ohio? Consider the contrast of scale between a modern skyscraper and the Great Pyramid of Giza. We use steel and glass to reach the clouds, a fragile, high-maintenance climb that requires constant input of energy. The giants used granite and limestone to anchor the sky to the earth, a permanent, self-sustaining resonance. We are the tenants of a world built for giants, and we are trying to run it with a toddler's understanding of the controls. The erasure is intended to keep us from realizing that we are the ones who are primitive. Every time a new megalithic site is discovered, the timeline of civilization is pushed back another 1,000 years. First, it was the Sumerians at 3000 BCE. Then it was Göbekli Tepe at 9000 BCE. Now, we are finding sites that date to the end of the last ice age. The gatekeepers are running out of room. They are running out of rug to sweep the dust under. The intellectual provocation is this: if the giants were here during the ice age, and they built these structures to survive a global catastrophe, then they weren't just a different race. They were a different solution to the problem of existence. They didn't fight the earth. They harmonized with it. And that harmony is what the current power structure fears most. A harmonized population is a population that doesn't need to be told what to do. I found a series of photographs from a 1940s expedition to the Amazon that had been lost in a house fire in 1962. A copy had survived in a private collection in Brazil. The photos showed a tribe of people who were not giants themselves, but who lived in the ruins of a city built for giants. The scale was undeniable. The stone benches were at chest height for the explorers. The stairs required a ladder to climb. But the most unsettling part was the expressions on the faces of the researchers in the photos. They weren't excited. They were terrified. They looked like people who had realized that their place in the universe had just been downgraded. This is the emotional tone of the investigation. It is the tense, mysterious realization that the world is much older and much more crowded than we were led to believe. The giants are not just a historical fact. They are a psychological weight. They force us to confront the possibility that we are not the protagonists of history, but the secondary characters who wandered onto the set after the main actors left. What if the human story is just a footnote in the giant epic? Ask yourself, if you were a giant and you saw the tiny, frantic creatures that would eventually replace you, would you leave them a map? Or would you leave them warning? The technical terms of the erasure are often hidden in the field of genetics. We are told that junk DNA is just evolutionary leftovers, a chaotic mess of discarded code. But what if that code isn't junk? What if it's the deactivated blueprints for the giants? We see the atavism of children born with 6 fingers or double rows of teeth, and the medical establishment moves quickly to correct these anomalies. They call it surgery. I call it evidence tampering. They are trimming the hedges of our genome to keep the giant from growing back. The rhythmic sentence structure of the gatekeepers is always the same. Cut it, hide it, forget it. But the body remembers. The phantom limb of our species is our lost height, our lost strength, and our lost connection to the Earth's frequency. We feel it in our dreams of flying, in our innate sense that we belong to the stars. The giants didn't just disappear from the books. They were folded into us. We are the crates. We are the Smithsonian basements. Each of us carries the suppressed history of a titan in our very cells, and that is the most forbidden knowledge of all. If we ever figured out how to turn that junk code back on, the world would once again have to accommodate a scale that it is currently trying to forget. In the late 19th century, a gentleman explorer named Captain George Hull became famous for the Cardiff Giant, a 10-foot tall petrified man that was eventually revealed to be a hoax. The academic world uses the Cardiff Giant as a shield. Every time a real skeleton is found, they point to the hoax and laugh. This is the psychological operation of the erasure. You create a fake to discredit the real. You make the subject of giants so ridiculous that no serious scientist will risk their career to investigate it. It is the UFO tactic applied to archaeology. Not a skeleton, not a fossil, a joke. But ask yourself, why would someone go to the trouble of creating an elaborate hoax if there wasn't a real phenomenon they were trying to hide? The Cardiff Giant wasn't a prank, it was a preemptive strike. It was a way to poison the well of public inquiry before the real discoveries in the American West could be understood. The skepticism of authority must also be a skepticism of the debunkers. Often, the person who screams hoax the loudest is the one standing in front of the evidence. I spent a week in the archives of a Jesuit college in Pennsylvania, looking for the journals of a missionary who had travelled to the Patagonian wilderness in the 1700s. I found a letter he had written to his superior in Rome. He described a meeting with a king of the southern lands who was so tall the missionary's head only reached the king's waist. The king didn't speak, he hummed. He made a sound that made the missionary's teeth ache and the local birds fall silent. This is the resonance again. The giants didn't communicate like us. They didn't use staccato, broken language. They used the fundamental frequency of the world. The erasure of the giants was also an erasure of this language. We were given words to divide us, while they had sound to unite them. The somber reality of our linguistic isolation is a direct result of the fall of the giants. We are the heirs of the Tower of Babel, living in the ruins of a unified consciousness. The investigation moves from the bone to the breath. What if the silence of history is not just an absence of records, but a loss of the ability to hear the truth? As we reach the final part of this investigation, we are left with an unresolved, philosophical, open loop. If the giants were the original masters of the earth, and we are the smaller, managed replacements, then what is the ultimate goal of the system that hides them? Is it just about power and control, or is it something more disturbing? Perhaps the giants were not meant to disappear. Perhaps they were meant to be harvested. We see the patterns of erasure, the institutional gatekeeping and the global suppression, and we assume it is a human conspiracy. But what if the humans in charge are just as afraid as we are? What if they are hiding the giants not to protect their power, but to hide the fact that something even larger than a giant once came and took them away? The mounds are empty. The crates are being moved. The history is being scrubbed. We are the investigators standing in an empty room, looking at the marks on the wall where a giant once stood. We are left with the scale, the load distribution of a mystery that is too heavy for us to carry. Ask yourself one last time, When they finish erasing the giants, what will they start to write in their place? Not us, not them, something else. The shift in the narrative occurs when you stop looking at the mounds and start looking at the maps, not the modern topographic surveys, not the political boundaries, something else. If you overlay the locations of the suppressed 19th century finds with the world's most secure military installations, the coincidence ends. The pattern becomes a mandate. It is a geographic load distribution of power. Why are the most significant restricted zones in the American Southwest exactly where the accounts of red-haired giants were most prevalent in the 1870s? The institutional gatekeeping has evolved from the archive to the perimeter fence. I stood at the edge of a Nevada test range, watching the heat shimmer off the salt flats, and realized that we aren't being protected from what's inside. The fence is there to protect the lie of what's underneath. Ask yourself why the most desolate places on Earth, the places where giants were said to retreat, are now the places where we test our most destructive weapons. Is it a matter of space, or is it a matter of sterilization? What if we are still trying to kill what we couldn't bury? The skepticism of authority is not a choice here. It is a survival mechanism. We are told these lands are empty, wastelands, but the stones tell us they were the last strongholds of a Titan class that refused to submit to the thinning. The staccato rhythm of the desert wind carries a frequency that the EMF meters can't quite catch, but the body feels it. It is the feeling of being watched by something that doesn't need eyes to see you. I met a former military contractor in a diner in northern New Mexico who spoke about the deep earth excavations of the 1990s. He didn't talk about aliens. He didn't talk about spaceships. He talked about the smell of ozone and the sound of breaking crystal. He described a chamber uncovered 3 miles down that was large enough to house a cathedral. Inside, they found furniture, not carved from wood, not forged from steel, grown from the rock itself. He said the chairs were 12 feet high. He said the tools on the tables looked like tuning forks, the size of a man. The unsettling part of his story wasn't the size, it was the abandonment. He said it looked like they had left in a hurry, or perhaps they had been blinked out of existence in a single moment. This is the erasure trope taken to its ultimate conclusion, the deletion of a present reality. The institutional response was immediate. The contractor was retired early. The chamber was filled with high-density concrete. The paperwork was classified under structural stability, not an archaeological site, not a historical discovery, a safety hazard. This is how the giants are handled in the modern age. They are turned into hazards so that the public will be grateful for their burial. Ask yourself, what kind of history requires 10,000 tons of concrete to keep it secret? The intellectual provocation deepens when we consider the physics of the giants. We are taught the square cube law, which suggests that if you double the height of a human, you triple the weight and quadruple the stress on the bones, making such beings impossible. This is the ultimate scientific gatekeeping. It uses a narrow window of current physics to deny a historical reality. But what if the square cube law is not a constant? What if the gravity of the Earth is not a constant? If you look at the fossils of the Carboniferous period, dragonflies with 3-foot wingspans, trees that should have collapsed under their own weight, you see a world with a different density. The giants were not impossible. They were perfectly adapted to a world that had a different relationship with weight. The somber reality is that the Earth is getting heavier for life. We are shrinking because the world is becoming more restrictive. The giants were the masters of a lighter, more expansive reality. Their disappearance was a signal that the golden age was over. We are the heavy humans, pinned to the dirt by a gravity that our ancestors would have found suffocating. The staccato sentence structure of our modern life, the rush, the pressure, the weight, is a direct result of this physical decline. We are the compressed version of a once vast species. I spent months tracking the Smithsonian crate myth across the Midwest. Every small town museum has a story about a giant skeleton that was found in the 1920s, picked up by a man from the Smithsonian and never seen again. People call it a legend. I found the shipping manifests. In a regional railway archive in Illinois, I found a record of a special heavy-duty transport in August of 1934. The weight of the anthropological specimens was listed as 4 tons. For 6 skeletons, that is not the weight of human bone, that is the weight of something much denser. Not this anatomy, not that anatomy, something else. The crates weren't sent to the public display halls. They were sent to Facility 4, a location that does not appear on any modern map of Washington, D.C. This is the institutional erasure in its most bureaucratic form. The giants didn't vanish into thin air. They vanished into a filing system. They were turned into numbers, and then the numbers were deleted. Ask yourself, if the giants were just deformed humans, why the need for secret transport? Why the need for a weight rating that exceeds a modern truck? What if the bones were actually closer to stone? What if the giants were slowly petrifying while they were still alive? Consider the contrast of scale in our myths. We have David and Goliath. We have Jack and the beanstalk. In every story, the giant is a slow, dim-witted brute who is defeated by the clever, smaller human. This is the psychological conditioning of the survivor. We have rewritten the giants as monsters to justify our occupation of their world. But if you look at the actual ruins they left behind, the precision of the Giza casing stones, the astronomical alignment of the Karnak stones, you see an intelligence that dwarfs our own. They weren't brutes. They were the mathematicians of the soul. The erasure trope works by making the victim look unworthy of the history they built. We are told they were cannibals and savages, but the masonry tells a story of peace, of long-term planning, and of a deep understanding of the cosmos. The tension of the investigation comes from realizing that we are the ones who are savage. We are the ones who use the stones of their temples to build fences. We are the ones who grind their bones into the dust of our progress. The giants didn't fall because they were weak. They fell because they were out of sync with a world that was becoming increasingly small-minded. In the mountains of Tibet, there are accounts of rainbow bodies, beings who can transcend the physical form through sound. The local legends say the giants were the first to master this. They didn't die, they resonant shifted. They moved into a frequency that our smaller, denser brains can no longer perceive. This is the pseudo-academic language of the hidden truth. The institutional gatekeepers call it mythological metaphor. I call it a technical manual for disappearance. If you look at the acoustical chambers found in the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum in Malta, you find a room that vibrates at 111 Hz, the exact frequency that induces a trance state in the human brain. The room was built for a much larger body. When a giant hummed in that room, the stone didn't just vibrate, it dissolved. This is the resonance of the Titans. They didn't build with tools, they built with song. And when the song changed, they moved on. The somber realization is that they left the instruments behind, but we have forgotten how to play them. We walk through their ruins like ants walking across a piano. wondering why the world feels so silent. The eighth part of the pattern is the erasure of the red hair. From the mummies of the Taklamakan Desert to the nobility of ancient Peru, red hair is a recurring anomaly that the academic world refuses to address. They call it environmental staining. They call it the effect of tanning agents. But when you test the hair, you find it lacks the chemical signatures of post-mortem change. These people were born with the colour of the sun on their heads. The giants were often described as having hair like copper and eyes like the sea. In many indigenous traditions, they were known as the cloud people. Why is this specific trait so dangerous to the narrative? Because it suggests a global, seafaring civilization that existed long before the age of discovery. It suggests that the giants were the ones who connected the continents. The institutional gatekeeping of our genetic history is designed to keep us divided by race and geography. But the red-haired giants prove that we were once one world under one scale. Not this tribe, not that tribe, one species. The erasure of their colour is the erasure of our common origin. I found a document in a declassified British intelligence file from the 1950s regarding anomalous excavations in the Middle East. The report described a series of sarcophagi found near the Euphrates. They were 14 feet long. When the lids were lifted, the bodies inside were perfectly preserved in a clear, viscous fluid. The report stated that the bodies were warm to the touch. The investigation was immediately taken over by a group identified only as the architects. The sarcophagi were flown out under the cover of a local conflict. This is the staccato rhythm of the managed truth. Find, liquidate, relocate. Silence. The giants are not just a part of our past. They are a resource for our present. What if the fluid in those coffins is the secret to the longevity of the elite? What if the giants are being used as biological batteries for a system that has forgotten how to generate its own power? The skepticism of authority must go deeper than politics. It must go into the very lifeblood of the people who rule us. Are they even the same species as us, or have they grafted themselves onto the lineage of the Titans? As we move towards final sections, the sense of forbidden knowledge becomes a physical weight. You begin to see the erasure trope in every news cycle, in every scientific breakthrough that is delayed or refuted. The giants are the anchor of a reality that the world is trying to float away from. They are the evidence that we are not the masters of our destiny. We are the inheritors of a broken world, and the people in charge are busy hiding the pieces of the original. I sat in a library in Rome and looked at a map from the 1400s that showed the land of the giants in the center of Africa. The map was drawn with a precision that shouldn't have been possible. Beside the land was a note in Latin. Here live the ones who remember the stars. Ask yourself, what did they remember that we were forced to forget? What if the stars aren't just lights in the sky, but the place they went when the earth became too heavy? The intellectual provocation is that we are the ones who are stranded. We are the ones who were left behind in the thinning. The final pattern is the return. In every culture that speaks of giants, there is a prophecy of their awakening. Not a physical resurrection, not a zombie story. Something else. A shift in resonance. As the Earth's magnetic field begins to weaken, as it is doing now, the frequency of the planet is changing. The heavy world is thinning out again. The gatekeepers are panicked. They are building their underground bunkers and their satellite arrays, trying to maintain the density of their control. But the bones in the crates are starting to hum. The mounds are starting to pulse. The load distribution of history is shifting back toward the Titans. The somber, mysterious truth is that you cannot erase what is built into the bedrock of reality. You can hide the bones, but you cannot hide the scale. The investigation ends not with a conclusion, but with a question that echoes in the empty halls of our history. What if the reason they are so afraid of the giants is that the giants are already among us, waiting for the air to get thin enough for them to breathe again? Not them, not us. Something else. The transition from the physical to the ethereal began with a series of suppressed radio intercepts from the Antarctic expedition of 1947. Not a military secret, not a navigational error. Something else. The transcripts, which surfaced briefly in a leak in the late 90s, spoke of massive subterranean structures emitting a low-frequency hum. The investigators didn't find frozen wastelands. They found a heat signature that suggested a city. They found the load distribution of an empire that existed beneath the ice, protected from the thinning of the atmosphere that had claimed their northern kin. Ask yourself why every major world power has a permanent, heavily militarized presence on a continent that is supposedly a barren desert of ice. Is it for the minerals, or is it to monitor the pulse? The institutional gatekeeping of Antarctica is the ultimate seal on our history. It is the cold storage for the truth of the giants. We are told the ice has been there for millions of years, but the Piri Reis map and others like it suggest a time when the coastline was clear, when the old men of the south still walked the shores. This is the staccato rhythm of the deep freeze. Hide, freeze, deny, silence. What if the giants didn't die out, but simply retreated to the one place on Earth where the density of the world still matched their own? I encountered a retired satellite technician in a suburb of Zurich who had spent his career scrubbing images for a private aerospace firm. He showed me a raw file before it had been processed for the public database. It was a region of the Sahara known as the Empty Quarter. In the raw image, the shadows were wrong. The dunes were covering the sharp geometric angles of a city built on a scale that defied human engineering. The doorways were 40 feet high. The streets were wide enough for a modern highway. But in the official version of the image, there was nothing but sand. This is the digital erasure. This is the pseudo-academic camouflage of the 21st century. If you can't see it from space, it doesn't exist. If the data is corrected before it reaches your screen, you have no way to know you are being lied to. The technician was somber. He said he had seen hundreds of these sites. Sunken cities in the Atlantic, massive walls in the Amazon, sprawling complexes in the Gobi. All of them were corrected out of existence. He didn't use the word conspiracy. He used the word management. We are a managed species, living in a managed reality, walking over the ruins of a Titan class that has been photoshopped out of our consciousness. Consider the nature of the giant's tools that occasionally surface in private auctions. I saw a copper axe head in a vault in London that weighed 75 pounds. The edge was still sharp. The grip was designed for a hand 3 times the size of mine. The academic explanation was that it was a cult object, a ceremonial item never intended for use, not a tool, not a weapon, a symbol. But if you look at the wear on the blade, you see it was used to cut stone. If you look at the stress fractures in the copper, you see it was swung with a force that would shatter a human wrist. This is the intellectual provocation. We are surrounded by the functional hardware of a giant civilization, and we are told it is art. We are like children finding a high voltage transformer and being told it's a toy. The skepticism of authority must extend to the very definitions of the objects we see. Why is a giant tool always ceremonial? Why is a giant building always a temple? What if they were just houses? What if they were just workshops? The erasure trope works by stripping the practical reality from the past and replacing it with mysticism. It makes the giants unreachable, when in fact they were the ultimate pragmatists. The pattern moves from the tool to the tooth. In the 1950s, a cave in Nevada yielded a set of molars that were 3 times the size of a modern human's. They were found alongside charcoal from a fire and the bones of a mountain sheep. The evidence was clear. Someone had been living there, eating there, and surviving. The teeth were sent to a university in California, where they were lost during a renovation. This is the staccato beat of the Administrative Vanishing Act, not a theft, not a fire, a clerical error. I tracked the professor who had originally received the teeth. He was 90 years old and living in a nursing home. When I asked him about the molars, his hand started to shake. He didn't talk about biology. He talked about the men in the grey suits. He said they told him that some truths were inflationary, that if they were released, the value of every other truth would drop to 0. This is the economic load distribution of the lie. The giants are kept secret because their existence would bankrupt the current intellectual currency. We are invested in our own smallness. We have built an entire worldview on being the first and only intelligent species. To admit to the giants is to admit that we are the second and lesser. As we approach the final threshold of this investigation, the tension becomes almost unbearable. You begin to see the institutional gatekeeping in the very way our cities are built. We build with a planned obsolescence, with materials that crumble in a century. The giants built for eternity. Their load distribution was not just physical, but temporal. They built structures that would stand until the earth itself changed. We are the staccato people, living in short, frantic bursts, while they were the continuous people. The somber, unsettling reality is that the giants are still winning the long game. Their walls are still standing. Their mounds are still pulsing. Their junk DNA is still sitting inside us, waiting for the right frequency to wake up. The investigation doesn't end with a smoking gun. It ends with a realization that the gun is still being pointed at us. We are being held at bay by a system that is terrified of what we might become if we remembered who we were. Ask yourself, what if the return of the giants is not a physical event, but a psychological one? What if the moment you believe in them, the erasure begins to fail? The final part of this section deals with the great erasure of the 1940s, a period when the world was distracted by war and the maps were being redrawn. It was during this time that the Global Archaeological Accord was quietly signed, ensuring that any find of non-standard human remains would be immediately turned over to a centralized authority, not for study, not for preservation, for neutralization. This is the point where the mystery becomes a crime. The giants were not just forgotten, they were hunted. The last of the outliers were tracked down in the remote corners of the world and removed. The silence that followed was not natural, it was the silence of a grave. We are living in the aftermath, a quiet, sterilized world where the only giants left are the ones in our nightmares. But the resonance is still there. If you stand in the center of a stone circle at dawn, you can feel it. If you look at the stars and feel a pull that is stronger than gravity, you can feel it. The giants are not gone. They are just waiting for us to grow up.